Hello and welcome to the Irish Fire Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Houghton. I'm an entrepreneur, investor, and financial independence enthusiast, sharing my financial freedom journey. Stay tuned and welcome aboard. I hope you are doing well. Just providing a very quick personal update. I'm currently halfway through a 3-week mini retirement, if you like. So I took my first mini retirement back at the end of 2023, and that was a 3-week break. I think I mentioned it a couple of times on previous episodes that I have been feeling a little bit of burnout. So I did negotiate to take another 3-week mini retirement, if you like. And last week we spent a week down in North Kerry, which was lovely. We actually had good weather this year, so unlike last year where we sat in the rain for a week, we actually got to go out and do a little bit of swimming and so on and so forth, which was wonderful. And you know, what's really great about family holidays is we do save up around €250 a month for our annual vacation, and as part of that we get a spending allowance of €100 a day, which is outside of our normal groceries and other costs. So it's quite nice to go away for a week and suddenly have this disposable income. And as part of that, it was really quite interesting to see. It was actually hard to spend the money some days. It also felt kind of a little bit strange sometimes doing it as well. So there was one day we went out for dinner, and that was great. We spent around €70 for a family of 5, and we had a good meal. But surprisingly, our best day was the day that we spent the least amount of money. It was a windy Wednesday, and we went down to the beach, and I suggested to the kids and to my wife that maybe we see if we could buy some kites. And the kites are for sale in the local shop for €4, and we were able to launch them right up. And at one stage we had all 4 kites flying hard, and we ended up finishing the day buying fish and chips, which cost us around €28 for the family of 5. So it was actually the day that we spent the least amount of money, and it was ironically the most enjoyable day. It just goes to show that it definitely isn't spending money that really makes a difference, but actually coming up with unique and creative ways to, spend your time. I'm currently halfway through this 3-week break, and I'm definitely not missing work. In fact, I'm almost lethargic about the fact that I do have to eventually get out of this 3-week break. It's one of these things is the closer we get to financial independence, the harder it is to kind of keep grinding. And I did actually give notice recently to the moonlighting project that I took on back in March. So I am looking forward to finishing that towards the end of August, maybe early September. And it will reduce our savings rate, but I'm definitely looking forward to cutting back. And I'm going to touch on this a little bit later in the episode. But today's episode is, the end of the trilogy of the last 3 episodes. So the first one was Enough is Enough. The second one was the 7 Steps to FI. And this episode is titled The Theory of Fire. And I guess it sums up and provides a little bit more context around what FI really means. And I alluded to it on the last 2 episodes, particularly the last one, around the fact that fire is nothing more than a state. It's a place that we get to. And once we hit fire, we have the option to retire early if we want to, but for most we won't. And so this is a really important distinction. And for most of us, there should be an S between the FI and the RE. So really what most of us are doing is we're hitting financial independence and then we're semi-retiring. We're certainly not retiring in the traditional sense, although we certainly could. When it comes to calculating our FI number, I've alluded to it both on the blog and the podcast, that we use this die with zero calculator that Tina from Money Flamingo came up with. And I've mentioned previously that we no longer use the 4% rule from the Trinity study. However, that's actually not true. On reflection, I've realized that the die with zero calculator is nothing more than a practical version of the 4% rule. You see, most of us, particularly those of us in Ireland or in any high tax country, have probably alluded to the fact that hitting financial independence or hitting a FI number based on withdrawing 4% per year on your current spending makes little sense when there's all these other factors at bay, particularly if you have children and your expenses at the moment are particularly high. For many years, I was frustrated with the fact that in Ireland we have these 50% tax rates, and it's going to be that much more challenging for us to build an FI portfolio. However, I started reflecting on the fact that we have this extremely generous state pension. And then there's this whole thing of our mortgage being paid off one day, and the fact that that's going to result in a lot less cash flow being needed to sustain our lifestyles. And then maybe this also, for many of us, might be lucky enough to one day receive an inheritance. So how do we calculate all of these things when it comes to building our FI number around the 4% rule? Back in 2021, I had this thought that maybe instead of withdrawing 4% based on the fact that all of these things are going to be coming to me, that instead we'll just use a 5% withdrawal rate. And hey, that's much easier to calculate and much easier to get to. But still, that doesn't really make sense. You see, the thing is, when we look at it from a European context, we know that our spending will decrease as we get older. We don't have these rising healthcare costs, or at least in the same way that those in America do. And for many of us rearing children, we know that our expenses at the moment are the highest that they're likely ever to be. So wouldn't it be great if we could use the 4% rule, but also account for the fact that our income levels are going to be changing over time? And voila, this is what the Die with Zero calculator allows us to do. It doesn't worry about building an infinite wealth like the 4% rule, which basically says if you hit a certain number and withdraw 4%, you'll be able to do that indefinitely. Now, as it is, the study only uses a 30-year time frame, and I'm well aware of that. But look, we need to be planning somewhat around the fact that we are looking to have the option to retire early. The way that I've used the Die with Zero calculator, and the way that I think it works best by allowing us to use that Trinity study and use that 4% rule, is simply entering in as our expected return when we do the calculator 4% as our expected return. Lo and behold, we're now using the exact metrics that the Trinity study encourage us to do. And the best part is that Die with Zero calculator is using a real return in the same way that the Trinity study does. In other words, it accounts for inflation. All the numbers we enter are in today's dollars, and it assumes that we are going to account for inflation because our expected return is lower and accounts for the real return, not the actual return, which is obviously inflation included. So when we use that Die with Zero calculator effectively, we put in our figures, and for each and every year, we forecast our total withdrawals needed depending on our age. And it's pretty easy to forecast when we know that our mortgage will be paid off at some point. And at some point, we'll be eligible for the state pension. And at some point, perhaps our expenses won't be as high because we won't be raising children anymore, and so on and so forth. So we can make some assumptions. And it will likely mean that our FI number will be significantly lower than if we used a traditional 4% rule. I've mentioned it already that financial independence is a state. It's a theory-based thing. It will change depending on market returns. And the cool thing about the Die with Zero calculator is that it actually allows us to keep on track of our FI state by updating the calculator as often as we like, let's say monthly or yearly, to double check that we are still technically FI based on certain parameters. Now, I use the assumption that I will live to 100 years of age, which would be a great thing, obviously. But you can build it out in such a way that at some point, particularly once you get the state pension, your wealth will start to be indefinite from that point. And that makes sense. And we can just let the portfolio grow and withdraw at that steady 4%. But it allows us to build and plan our FI number in a much more accurate way. If you're currently single, maybe unmarried, maybe you're in your early 20s or 30s and you haven't forecasted what it's going to be like when you have children one day and so on, well, guess what? You can do this with this calculator. You can change the numbers to assume that, hey, maybe you'll have children one day, or maybe you'll be married at this point, and so on and so forth. Or perhaps you'll just keep it in its current state, and if you do happen to meet that special person and your life situation changes, then you can update this calculator and magically can see your new FI number based on that. Your FI number then becomes a point at which you hit a certain number and stop making contributions from that point. So roughly speaking, ours is based on hitting a portfolio value of 750,000 euros roughly at the end of next year, which we're currently on track to do. I do blog about this stuff, guys, but I am going to share a link in the show notes of this podcast episode showing our breakdown based on a 4% withdrawal rate based on us hitting that magic 750,000 and making withdrawals from 2026. Hopefully it will help you guys to build your own metrics. And guys, if you are listening to this episode before the 31st of July 2024, I am going to be giving a live meetup specifically on the Die with Zero calculator. I will share a link in the show notes. It is open to anybody who listens to the podcast. So please do come along. It's an online meetup. There is no cost, and it'll be great to interact on a more real-time basis. The last point then, I alluded to this on the last episode from the book Taking Stock, and it's actually something that ironically I happened to receive an article from the Mad Scientist on during the week. It's an article that he wrote back in 2021 called Happiness Through Subtraction, and it's about the concept that all of us look for happiness and we try to work out what would make us happy, and this can be really hard to measure. However, what's easier to measure is working out what makes us unhappy, and this concept of removing the things that don't bring us happiness. Financial independence gives us more options. And as I alluded to earlier, one of those options could be early retirement. But for most of us, it's just going to be removing certain negative aspects from our lives. I'll share a link in the show notes to this article from the Mad Fientist. It's quite fascinating what he put himself through to hit financial independence. And look, there's been so much content covered in more recent years that his approach isn't the way to go about financial independence, and he openly admits this himself. He basically took any unnecessary spending out of his life because he was so tunnel focused on his financial independence goal. And we know that a certain degree of balance is needed. He had this dream that when he hit financial independence, all of his happiness and dreams were going to come true. And the reality was very different. However, one key aspect from this article is this ability to take things away to allow us to build happiness. And for so many of us, hitting financial independence will allow us to start fulfilling some of these things. So it might be that we move from full-time to part-time employment, or perhaps we start working 3 or 4 days per week and get that extra 50 or 100 days free time to ourselves where we're no longer having to go to work. There's also a psychological aspect to it. So maybe we'll stop going to that meeting that we hate. Or maybe, you know what, we will work from home. Or maybe we will pick our kids up from school or drop them off to school and not worry too much about being late for that 9 o'clock meeting. Because hey, at this stage, if we get fired, we're already financially independent anyway. So there's lots of great things we gain from this concept of removing the things that we don't like in our lives. And here's the best part. We don't have to wait until we're FI to start doing this. If I go back to many of the articles I've written over the years and listen back to podcast episodes that I've recorded and released previously, I often talk about making changes in work and removing certain things in work to make work more bearable. At some point, though, we get to do that in more extremes, and certainly I've noticed as we get closer to FI, I've started to enjoy work a lot more because I've been able to cut out the things that don't make me happy. Back in March, I did take on a second project. I decided to ramp up again our savings rate in this race to FI. At the time, I thought, or was under the impression, that we needed to pay off 3 mortgages to hit FI. I hadn't done the full calculations that I alluded to earlier on this episode in relation to using the Die with Zero calculator correctly. Since updating our FI number and reflecting on this, I've realized we don't need to be in such a race. We're going to hit that FI number at some point in 2025. So there's no need for us to work at such an extreme pace. And getting back that extra 2 to 3 hours per day is well worth the trade-off. And so I have given notice to that project, and I am looking forward to reducing our work before we hit FI, knowing that all of this money and all of this freedom that we've created for ourselves has allowed us to start making these sorts of decisions. Financial independence and one's FI journey can be challenging. It can be difficult to continually save 50% and more of your income. But the options and freedom that we gain along the way certainly makes the whole journey worth it. As always, guys, if you have any questions on this episode, drop me an email at michael@firepodcast.ie, and I look forward to catching you on the next episode.